What's the name of the movie where Eddie Redmayne plays Stephen Hawking?
Theory of Everything.
Yeah.
Oh,
And it was remarkable, though, the way he captured Stephen Hawking's. But in a way, that was, an easier thing than some of the subtle postural communiques that actors.
yes. I happen to know his coach, and what he did to prepare for that role was that he learned every single muscle in his body, and he learned how to contact it and then let it go. And that's, of course, the illness as it progressed.
Yeah.
There's one muscle that goes, the next muscle that goes.
Yeah.
And that's how he trained. It took him a long time to
I'll
do
bet.
that.
I bet that was a lot of work.
It was a lot of work.
homework.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But he's a really good actor.
Yeah.
And I think you find that with really good actors, that they put the time into it.
Yeah. It's always fascinated me to see what makes a performance real
Right.
and convincing
Yeah.
and authentic.
Yes.
How does an actor convey the subtlety of a feeling state, of an emotion, of not only gross emotions, strong emotions,
Right.
but the very subtle emotions that we experience in everyday life and when we're in contact,
Right.
we're sitting talking
Yeah.
with somebody.
Yes. And just, I think that it's, the way I see it, it's almost more about what's in the way of that happening. That someone is trying to convey something, or they have a preconceived idea of what it is. So in that moment, they're not really present, and their body, mind, spirit is not open to the imaginary circumstances of the given
Right. I guess
play.
maybe the brief way to say that is that it's either not or is embodied,
Exactly.
so that the character really exists within the body
Yes.
of the actor.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you have the same thing with all artists or performers. What for them to be in that moment of what they're doing.
When you see an artist, a performer that's deeply embodied, you know that.
Yes.
You may not have the words for it, but it's being fully aware in their living, sensing body that allows that to be a vehicle to communicate some of the deepest and subtlest of feeling states and moods.
Yes. And I think that to have that, one needs to have the muscular system able to adjust to the moment, the respiratory system.
The guts, the viscera.
Absolutely. And when one of those systems is held back, then the story isn't conveyed fully. And that's when, as an audience member, I'm not.
It just doesn't seem, it seems artificial.
Yes, they're not believable
It's
anymore.
Not believable, yeah.
And there's a couple of telltales of inexperienced or younger actors, or even performers in general, and one of them is that they're not really comfortable in their lower body. Their lower bodies are just not connecting to the ground and really engaged in the character. You'll see sort of held knees, that kind of thing. And the other is a kind of like either pushing their head forward to, I'm going to tell you something, I'm going to tell you something, that kind of thing, instead of being with what is.
You know, it's like if you see a stalking cheetah moving, moving into a possible impala kill. The way the body is used conveys to you this whole story, and that's fully embodied. Now,
And it's active and inhibitive, because they're going toward, but the inhibition is like,
and then,
not yet, not
right,
yet.
it's in that readiness.
Yes.
In that readiness to,
So exciting.
Now, I think the difference between that and a human, a person that's embodied, is our conscious awareness of that.
Yes.
Who knows what the cheetah is consciously aware of, but with humans it's a different level.
Right.
And how to be natural, how to allow our inner instinctual parts to express themselves,
Right.
to be aware of that and able to also guide that in the service of the role, in service of being the actor, the performer.
Yeah.
You know, another thing that I've noticed in roles, and it's somewhat related to the emotion that person's embodying and expressing, but it's more than that even, and that's about conveying vulnerability.
Right.
And one can't do that without actually feeling vulnerable.
Right.
And I think it's a feeling that most of us fear.
Yes.
You know, because
those sensations of that.
The sensations of that,
Yeah,
the feeling of vulnerability, even the judgments about that. And, you know, and however, and the research really even supports this, that when we're vulnerable, or we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, that's very often when we are at our greatest strength and power.
Sort of what gets in the way of one's ability to have that vulnerability.
That's right.
Because the vulnerability is going to come in some kind of authentic
That's right.
communication, and that's going to involve my breathing. And so if I don't have some sense of the air filling me,
The softness of the breath.
the softness of the breath, and the conveying of the taking in, you know, if it's an actor, a scene, taking in your scene partner, or a musician, taking in your ensemble.
And the audience.
And the audience, exactly. And so there's some giving, you know, giving out and in, and that breath is so instrumental in that process. So if someone's breath is really held to hold their own difficulty or their own emotions that they're not willing to feel, like you were saying, then there's a lack in the performance.
Yeah, and vulnerability isn't something you can fake.
Right.
You have to be able to feel it.
Yes.
But then also, in a sense, when we leave the role and go back down onto 42nd Street, and we don't want to feel that vulnerability. Then we want to be able to contain it.
Yes.
Enough, not to suppress it, but to contain it. So again, how do we change what's going on in our bodies and our awareness so when we leave the role, we're able to come back to our everyday navigation.
Right, and I think the really important part on that is knowing my own habitual patterns. Because if I see a friend in the distance and he moves with his shoulder, and I say, that's Harry, he moves like that, I can recognize him. But that's not great for an actor, because he needs to change that pattern to transform into someone else. So the actor has to know their own pattern when they know what's theirs, what's dramatic tension
yeah.
and what's personal tension.
Yeah.
Right?
And to work that interface.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah,
to
yeah.
that distinguish, to really distinguish.
And that takes making some kind of encounter with our own emotional world,
Right.
with our own sensate
Yes.
world,
Yes.
with our own awareness, our embodiment of our postures and our movements
Yes.
in space, and
Yes.
how those convey those inner sentiments.
Yes. And sometimes I'll work with an actor and they do a piece and I just put my hands lightly on their shoulders because there's something not moving through, and the tears will just, come out because they're feeling something of their own experience.
Right.
And they have to, I think, work through and understand their own so that they can change things and to convey
Right.
the
So-
story.
Right,
Really.
so they can use their feelings and their
Yes,
emotions
yeah.
to convey the story, but not be used by them.
Yeah, because in that, often what is happening is, with the actor especially, is bringing in, like if there's a character that's angry, the actor is bringing in their version of anger.
Yes.
And the character they're playing might have a very different way of expressing anger. And if you just are doing your anger, then you can't allow what might be conveyed by the character, which would be more authentic to the performance.
That's right.
So
Again, I think it's that balance to be able to know our feelings,
yes,
be able to use that, but to be able to use that in the creative endeavor
yes,
of the role
Yes.
or as the function.
and to talk about the creative endeavor more and sort of bring it into music also. I work with a lot of jazz musicians, and they improvise, but
sure.
often their physicality is in the improvisation their physicality is the same. So sometimes the improvisation is kind of the same. And so sometimes when I work hands-on and change some of the muscular and breathing patterns, the musician will say, now when I go to improvise, I hear other notes that I never heard before. So I think that's a really important piece of this is being able to open what I call like the expanded self, to open to more of what's available as opposed to what I was holding back and didn't allow the story to come through. Either music, dance, or acting. I mean, it's all the performance element.
It's something that I was just thinking that I wanted to add is when I started developing my work, 45 years ago, there were, therapy often consisted of people abreacting their emotions, of getting their emotions out, of expressing their emotions. And it was sparse on actually feeling them. And I discovered that very often the expression of the emotion is contra to the feeling of the emotion.
Yes.
One of the things that happens in trauma is our emotions, our sensations and our emotions become fixed, they become stuck. And so our contact with our emotions is limited by our trauma. And so if we're able to touch into the trauma, and of course I work with thousands of people this way, then there gets to be a fluidity in feeling and expression. It's not that we are fixed on one way of expressing ourselves because our emotions are stuck in that way. So by being able to touch into and what I call renegotiate our traumas, to visit them, but not plunge into them, not be swallowed up by them, but to learn from them, because there are always lessons that are learned in being able to connect with one's frozenness and thaw that frozenness and open to this range of feelings and expressions, and how we then can convey that readily, fluidly to the other actors and, of course, to the audience.
Right. It kind of, as you talk about that frozen moment, it kind of reminds me of when a performer gets up in front of other people, and they were able to do it great in the shower, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that moment of coming up in front of other people and that often immediate freeze response.
Yeah.
But from understanding it, from what you're talking about, and understanding it from a different perspective, yes, that moment can be there, but there's something that I can do about it.
Yeah.
I can be in contact with what I call how I use myself. Yeah. So what I'm doing with the way I'm using my body, the way my muscles are able to move me through space, and I don't have to hold that frozenness. And the frozenness will not give me what I want in terms of performance. And again, how the breath will come in, and the nuance of movement, because it's that connection of the thought and the breath and the movement conveying what it is in the given moment that tells the story that I'm telling, no matter what, a dancer, a musician, or an actor, everybody is there to tell their story. And the interesting thing is, I think sometimes, often, I work with people who don't know they have trauma. You know what I mean? It's like like there's a singer, and he's singing, and he says his issue is he has trouble with high notes, but he thinks it's some kind of technical thing that he has to move in his throat or something to change that. And with this particular guy, that as we worked, one thing he said was, I can't sing high notes, and he did this motion. Uh-huh. And then the conversation went on, and I said to him, have you been singing since you were young? And he said, yes. And he said, I was at school, and I had a choice of music or athletics, and I chose music, but I had to take an audition. And they told me I was a boy soprano. So I said to him, oh, is that okay with you? And he said, oh yeah, I was in the 3rd grade, it was fine. He said, when I came home and told my mother that I was a boy soprano, she said, don't tell anyone. And he used the exact same motion that he had used when he said, I can't sing high notes.
Yeah, the same motion that she made.
Yes, exactly. So she's telling him singing high notes is a soprano, right? So she's telling him, don't tell anyone, you can sing high notes, and that's... Right. So when he matched that up, there was his high notes. It wasn't a technique. It was about connecting his motion and his intention and what was happening, and somebody pointing it out to him.
And sometimes we just think of trauma as these completely overwhelming things like war or being abused and so forth. But sometimes it's just a little quote, a little thing like that that can leave a lasting imprint, and it's in our body. And I think that's what we do. We observe to where it is that the person gets to this place where something got disconnected, something got stuck, and help them complete it. And in the completion, to come more deeply into themselves.
Exactly. And sometimes, they don't know that that's what's going on. They think it's some kind of other technical problem.
Thing.
Right.
And it could be.
Yes.
But again, the more you open your exploration, the more deeply you'll be able to work with whatever it is that place that's just not online.
Right. Yeah, there were so many. I have so many stories like that. There's one young woman was in a play, but it had a slight singing role, a few lines, and every time it was time to sing, she said she felt this dark cloud come over her, and the acting part was fine. And so when we worked, she remembered when she was young, some teacher along the way said, "Oh, you can't sing," and that dark cloud every time she sang came over her.
Yeah.
But once she realized it, and we talked about it, and her breath kicked in, and her eyes opened, and she took in the room and became alive, and her singing became equal to how she was acting. And so it's, yeah, again, we don't call that trauma, or it's overwhelm, or small trauma, however we call it. But it is.
Exactly. There's a rupture there of trust.
Yes.
And then we tend to then fill that rupture, that hole, with shame.
Yes.
And that's another thing that really is immobilizing.
Yes.
And when people feel shame, they would want to do anything but feel the shame, so they try to override it. And when they do that, again, they're losing connection with Source, with the creative, embodied Source.
And with actors, well, musicians too, there's this process that's called auditioning, and not getting the role, and the shame of or the vulnerability, or the shame, defeat, of that. I mean, they have to live and deal with that all the time. So,
that's a good point.
Yeah. Well, I think the Alexander technique is so multifaceted. It's got a lot of pieces to it. I mean, on one level, it's a technique for improving oneself, and it gives one is able to have access to chosen moments of how I use myself or what I do. If I go back to most people, children born healthy, move with a kind of lightness and ease that we like to look at, and we like, oh, isn't that, it touches us in a certain way. The grace and poise and freedom. And yet, we don't see that in most adults. We don't see that. And so the Alexander technique helps one to find the internal organization that gives you support. And when you have support, then the system is able to open and be freer. And that is, it's beneficial for not just performers also, right? And it opens the breathing and the whole system. And it also, in the technique, there's a lot of talk about choice, that in this moment, there's a stimulus, and most of us respond immediately with a response. But in the Alexander technique, it's kind of like when you were talking about the cheetah approaching the impala. If that cheetah was just following a stimulus, he could just go at the wrong time. Whereas if he's sort of waiting in each moment to decide, I'm going to change my response now, that kind of thing. It gives you a choice. There's sort of that small moment between stimulus and response to make another choice. And you can make it physically within myself. If I'm going to reach for a glass of water, I'm going to just reach, or I'm going to reach with less effort. And that's often the case. Again, bringing it back to performance, it's often a case of too much effort. And that too much effort squeezes the muscles, which then diminishes the system for both emotional expression and movement on all levels. And the Alexander technique really addresses that.
About posture.
Yes.
One of the really great influences in my work, in my life, was from a woman named Nina Bull.
Oh, right.
And
yes,
she didn't even have an advanced degree, but she was a researcher at Columbia University. Mm-hmm. And she discovered, through a very intricate set of experiments, that when a person was feeling angry, for example, their posture was in a very specific pattern.
Mm-hmm.
And in that pattern, they would feel anger.
Yes.
Now, they couldn't, even if they thought of something that was joyful, they were unable to feel the joy until they unlocked from the anger posture,
right,
and then could embody the joy posture. So when we're stuck in a particular posture, no matter what emotion we're trying to feel or express, we will be really just expressing the one that our body is stuck
exactly
in. And the way she discovered this is, she would have an experimental subject think of something that had to do with anger, a time when they were very angry, or even just the word, the emotion, anger. And then they would have the person lock that in their bodies.
Right.
And they would get reports from the subject, but also from observers who are trained to see these little shifts in posture. And that's how she discovered that you cannot feel one emotion while you're in the posture of another one. So when we have an habitual emotion, that's what we're going to express until we go to that posture of anger, deconstruct it, and then build a posture of joy or triumph.
Yes.
Whatever, but we can't do it until we come out of that one posture. We're stuck there.
That reminds me of the research of Frank Pierce Jones, who was an Alexander teacher, and he experimented with the startle reflex, similar to what you're talking about, and he filmed the startle reflex in multi-strobe photography. And he found that the first element of the startle reflex was pulling your head back. Startle reflex, for some people don't know, is you're basically you're startled, right? And so the first element of that is the pulling back at suboccipital in the back of your head here and tightening, and that will put someone in a startle pattern. And again, with performers, this is a huge piece to release this area here because again, this pullback here is a pullback. It takes you out, it takes you back somewhere. And the releasing of the suboccipital back of your head and coming into the moment is huge in performance. So her work in this context of the startle pattern is so important.
Exactly, and when you're in the startle pattern, you're hyper-focused, so you're not taking in the periphery.
Exactly,
And again, there's a limitation in terms of performance.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to playing together with you, to working together, and exploring these dimensions with a group of creative people.
And I think that part of our reason for doing this class is also that I think that we so appreciate performers. You know, we go to the theater or to hear music or to watch dance, and I'm so grateful that they're up there telling the stories that need to be told, you know, and giving over themselves and their body, mind, spirit to do this. And I think opening the field of admitting that there's trauma there. You know, the title of the class is Trauma in the Performing Artist. It's like nobody's talking about that. And we're willing to talk about it, and not just willing to talk about it in a theoretical way, but we're willing to dive in, both of us in our own ways, to and with these performers to these difficult places. We're willing to go there to have the performance pop and include what needs to be said. And I think that...
And to do that in a gentle way.
Exactly.
And again, it's not plunging into the trauma.
Right.
But learning to touch it and swim
Beautiful.
in
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so we can again use that as part of our personal experience, our unique experience,
Exactly.
to put that in a role and express that
Yes.
in that role.
Yes. Yeah. I'm excited.
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right.